Wyoming Territory, 1878, a land of endless skies and brutal winters, where men measured their worth by the strength of their backs and the steadiness of their aim. Among the rolling foothills of the Bighorn Mountains, Poplar Creek stood as a testament to human perseverance, a small but determined settlement carved from wilderness and held together by grit and neighborly bonds. Roy Daniels adjusted his hat against the afternoon sun as he guided his chestnut mare down the main street. At 25, Roy had already lived several lifetimes' worth of frontier experiences. The war between the states had stolen his youth, and the unforgiving plains had hardened what remained. His lean frame and sun-weathered skin told the story of long cattle drives and longer winters. Yet beneath his quiet demeanor and piercing blue eyes lay a young man still finding his place in a world that demanded men grow up too fast. "Afternoon, Mr. Harrison," Roy called to the storekeeper sweeping his porch. "Roy." "Just the man I needed to see." Harrison waved him over eagerly. Roy dismounted with the fluid grace that came from practically living in the saddle. "Something wrong?" "Not wrong, exactly. Got a telegram from old Judge Vance. Says his daughter's arriving on tomorrow's stage from Boston. Asked if you might escort her out to his place." Harrison handed over the yellow paper. Roy scanned the message with a frown. "Judge hasn't been out to that homestead in over a year. Place must be half collapsed by now. That's why he's asking for you specifically. Says you're the only hand he trusts to help get things proper for a lady." Roy's frown deepened. The judge had been good to him years back, giving him honest work when others saw only a haunted war veteran. But Roy had built his life around a simple truth: attachments were dangerous. The frontier was no place for sentiments or obligations. Men who tied themselves to others eventually watched those others die from disease, from violence, from the unforgiving land itself. "I've got my own place to mind," Roy said, though his voice lacked conviction. Harrison's eyebrows rose. "You're 20 acres and 3 cows. Judge is offering good money, son. 2 months' work, room and board. Plus," he added with a sly look, "might do you good to spend time with someone besides that mare of yours." Man wasn't meant to live so solitary. "The solitary man lives longest out here," Roy replied, the words familiar on his tongue. He had spoken some version of this philosophy many times to many well-meaning townspeople. "I'll escort the judge's daughter to the homestead and help with immediate repairs, but that's all." Harrison shrugged. "Judge said she's a bit particular, been sheltered her whole life. Might need more help than you think." "Mining." "Boston lady, Roy, probably never seen dirt up close. Word is she's not much to look at either, the plain, bookish type. Judge always said she was his ugly duckling, smart as a whip but no beauty." Harrison lowered his voice. "Judge is worried no man will have her, so he's sending her west hoping frontier standards might be more forgiving." Roy felt a flash of indignation on behalf of this unknown woman, followed immediately by renewed reluctance. An Eastern lady with no frontier experience would be worse than useless. She'd be a liability. Still, a debt was a debt, and he owed the judge. "I'll meet the stage," Roy said finally. "Get her settled, show her the basics. Then I'm back to my place." Harrison smiled. "Judge said you might say that. Said to remind you about the winter of 75. Roy's jaw tightened. During that brutal season, the judge had shared his own stores to keep Roy from starving when blizzards killed half his livestock. A debt indeed. Fine, 2 months, not a day more. As Roy rode back to his small homestead, he couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. Entanglements led to heartache. He'd built his entire adult life around this principle. The war had taken his brothers. The frontier had claimed good friends. The pox had stolen a woman he'd once thought to marry. Survival meant standing alone, needing no one, being needed by no one. Tomorrow would bring nothing but complications. He was certain of it. The following day dawned clear and cold, autumn painting the cottonwoods golden along the creek. Roy arrived in town early, his saddlebags packed for an extended stay. He'd spent the night making arrangements for a neighboring rancher to check on his place periodically. 2 months, he could endure almost anything for 2 months. The stagecoach arrived in a cloud of dust promptly at noon, the driver calling out greetings to familiar faces as he reined in the team. Roy hung back as passengers disembarked, a traveling salesman, an older couple, and finally, a young woman dressed in a severe navy traveling suit that had clearly seen better days during the long journey west. She stood uncertainly on the boardwalk, clutching a small valise and looking around with wide, anxious eyes. Roy approached slowly, taking her measure. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 21 or 22. Her light brown hair was pulled back in a practical but unflattering bun, and wire-rimmed spectacles perched on her nose. She wasn't ugly by any measure, but neither did she possess the kind of beauty that turned heads in saloons. Her face was pleasant but unremarkable, her figure slim beneath the ill-fitting clothing. "Miss Vance?" he asked, removing his hat. She turned to him, relief washing over her features. "Yes, are you Mr. Daniels?" "Roy Daniels, ma'am. Your father arranged for me to escort you to his homestead." "Oh, thank goodness, I was beginning to worry he'd forgotten." Her voice carried the refined tones of Eastern education, but lacked the condescension he'd expected. "I'm Olivia Vance. I appreciate you meeting me, Mr. Daniels." "Just Roy is fine, Miss Vance." "Then you must call me Olivia." She smiled tentatively, and for a moment something transformed her ordinary features, a brightness that caught him off guard. Then she sneezed, the spell broken. "Forgive me, the dust." Roy nodded, suddenly aware that half the town was watching their exchange with undisguised interest. "We should collect your trunks and be on our way. It's a few hours' ride to your father's place." Her smile faltered. "Ride, I assumed. That is, I thought there might be a wagon." "Stage brought your trunks this far. From here we ride." "Roads to your father's homestead barely deserve the name." Olivia paled slightly. "I see. Well, I'm sure I can manage." She straightened her shoulders with determination that belied her delicate appearance. "Though I should warn you, I've never actually ridden a horse before." Roy felt his heart sink. It was going to be a very long 2 months. The journey to Judge Vance's homestead took nearly twice as long as Roy had anticipated. Olivia proved to be an attentive but exceedingly cautious rider, clinging to her borrowed mare with white-knuckled determination. Her trunks followed on a packhorse that Roy led with a lead rope. "Your father mentioned you've been in Boston?" Roy asked, breaking a lengthy silence as they followed the winding creek. "Yes, with my aunt since I was 14. Olivia adjusted her spectacles, which kept slipping down her nose. "Father thought a proper Eastern education would serve me better than frontier schooling. Must be quite a change coming back." She laughed softly. "You have no idea. I barely remember Wyoming Territory. Everything seems so vast." "That it is." Roy found himself watching her face as she took in the landscape. There was something unguarded about her expressions, a transparency unusual in frontier folk who learned early to mask their feelings. "Father wrote that you've been helping with his property," she asked, "off and on." "He's been staying mostly in town these past years. Place needs work." Her brow furrowed. He didn't mention that in his letters. He made it sound quite established. Roy hesitated, uncertain how to prepare her for what lay ahead. "It's solid enough, nothing we can't set right." As they crested a low rise, Judge Vance's homestead came into view in the valley below. The main cabin stood intact, but the roof sagged visibly on one side. The small barn leaned precariously, and what had once been a kitchen garden was now a tangle of weeds and prairie grasses. Olivia reined in her horse, staring at the dilapidated scene. For a long moment she said nothing, and Roy watched her face carefully for signs of the tears or complaints he expected from an Eastern lady confronted with frontier reality. Instead, she took a deep breath and asked quietly, "Is there a well with clean water?" "Yes, ma'am, good water. And the roof doesn't leak too badly. Nothing I can't fix in a day or two." She nodded thoughtfully. "Then we have what we need to start with." Her eyes met his, showing not despair but calculation. "I suspect my father wasn't entirely truthful about the condition of things." Roy found himself impressed by her composure. "Judge has been living in town for most of 2 years now. His joints pain him too much for homestead work. Yet he's sent me here instead of to town." Her tone held no accusation, merely observation. "Interesting." As they rode down to the cabin, Roy found himself revising his assessment of Olivia Vance. She might lack frontier experience, but there was a practical intelligence in her approach that suggested adaptability. Nevertheless, the woman needed help, and clearly the judge had manipulated them both into this arrangement. The cabin's interior confirmed Roy's worst expectations. Dust covered every surface, mice had claimed corners for nests, and the stone chimney needed cleaning before it would be safe to light a fire. Olivia stood in the center of the main room, turning slowly to take in her new home. "Well," she said finally, "at least we won't have to worry about making it worse." The unexpected humor in her voice surprised a laugh from Roy. "That's one way of looking at it." She removed her spectacles and wiped them clean on her handkerchief, squinting slightly as she did. "My father asked you to stay and help, didn't he?" "For a time. To get you settled." She replaced her glasses and studied him with unexpected directness. "And you agreed because you owed him a favor." Roy shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "He's been good to me." "I see," she nodded decisively. "Then we should establish terms. I won't be a charity case, Mr. Daniels. I'll pay fair wages for your help, and I'll expect honest assessments of what I need to learn to survive here. Your father's already arranged payment. Then I'll reimburse him." She began rolling up her sleeves, revealing surprisingly strong-looking forearms for a city woman. "Now shall we start with making this place habitable for the night, or should we see to the horses first?" Roy stared at her, caught off guard by her practical approach. "Horses first, always horses first out here." "Light the way, then. I might as well begin learning immediately." As they walked to the barn, Roy found himself reassessing Olivia Vance yet again. The judge's ugly duckling might not turn heads with her beauty, but there was something compelling about her direct manner and quick mind. Still, he reminded himself, his involvement was temporary, 2 months to fulfill his obligation, then back to the solitary life he'd built. The frontier was no place for connections, and no place for a Boston-educated woman with spectacles and soft hands, no matter how practically she approached the challenge. The first week passed in a blur of backbreaking work. Roy repaired the roof while Olivia scrubbed years of grime from the cabin's interior. She approached each new task with the same methodical determination, asking concise questions and taking instruction without complaint. Her hands blistered then calloused, but she never mentioned the pain Roy knew she must feel. "You're handy with that broom," he observed one evening as they sat on the porch, too exhausted for conversation but not yet ready for sleep. The autumn air carried the scent of pine and the distant promise of winter. "Sweeping is sweeping, whether in Boston or Wyoming," she replied, then added with unexpected candor, "though I admit I've never done quite so much of it before." "You were what, then? A teacher?" She shook her head. "My aunt ran a small lending library. I helped catalog books, maintain accounts, that sort of thing." Her voice softened with memory. "I loved being surrounded by stories." "No books out here," Roy said, then immediately regretted his bluntness when her face fell slightly. "Actually," she said, recovering, "I brought several. They're in my trunk still. Perhaps when we have the cabin in better order, you might enjoy borrowing one." The suggestion caught him off guard. "Been a while since I had time for reading." "Everyone should make time for reading, Mr. Daniels. Stories remind us we're not alone in our experiences." She smiled, her face illuminated by the setting sun, and for a moment, Roy glimpsed something he hadn't noticed before, a kind of inner luminosity that transformed her ordinary features. He looked away quickly. Early start tomorrow. Need to mend that barn door before the wind picks up. If she noticed his abrupt change of subject, she didn't comment. But that night, as he lay on his bedroll in the lean-to he'd constructed beside the barn, propriety demanded he not sleep in the cabin. Roy found himself thinking about her words. Stories remind us we're not alone. The notion was antithetical to everything he believed about survival. Alone was safe. Alone meant no one to lose, no one to mourn. Yet something about Olivia Vance's quiet certainty lingered in his mind long after he should have been asleep. By the third week, the homestead had undergone a remarkable transformation. The roof no longer leaked, the chimney drew properly, the barn stood straight, and a small vegetable garden had been cleared and prepared for spring planting. Roy had shot a deer, and strips of venison hung smoking in the repaired smokehouse. More surprising than the physical changes was Olivia's own transformation. Daily work in the open air had brought color to her cheeks. She'd abandoned her restrictive Eastern clothing for practical skirts and shirtwaists, and often wore her hair in a simple braid that softened her features. Without constant dust irritating her eyes, she frequently went without her spectacles when working around the homestead. One afternoon, Roy returned from checking fence lines to find Olivia at the creek that ran behind the cabin. She stood knee-deep in the water, skirts hitched up and secured at her waist, attempting to catch fish with her bare hands. The sight stopped him in his tracks. Sunlight filtered through the cottonwoods, casting dappled patterns across the water and the woman in it. Her face was a study in concentration, brow furrowed, lower lip caught between her teeth. As he watched, she lunged suddenly, crying out in triumph as she tossed a wriggling trout onto the bank. "I did it," she exclaimed, looking up and spotting him for the first time. Her smile was radiant, transformed by pure joy. "Did you see my fifth one today?" Roy couldn't respond immediately. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the plain, nervous Easterner who'd stepped off the stagecoach. With her hair coming loose from its braid, cheeks flushed with success, and eyes bright with accomplishment, Olivia Vance was beautiful. The realization disturbed him more than he cared to admit. "Not bad," he managed finally, "though there are easier ways to catch fish." "But none as satisfying," she countered, splashing back to shore. As she gathered her catch, she added, "I found some wild onions and herbs while you were gone. I thought we might have a proper dinner tonight." "Sounds good." Roy turned toward the barn, needing distance from whatever was happening inside him. "Need to see to the horses." That evening they ate trout seasoned with wild herbs by lamplight at the table Roy had repaired. Olivia had set 2 places with the mismatched china she'd found and cleaned from a dusty cupboard. The simple meal tasted better than anything Roy could remember eating in years. "I received a letter from my father yesterday," Olivia said as they finished eating. "The stage brought it when you were in town for supplies." Roy looked up sharply. "Everything all right?" "Oh yes, he's doing well," she hesitated. "He mentioned he won't be joining me here after all. He's taken a position as circuit judge that will keep him traveling much of the year." The implications hung in the air between them. Judge Vance had never intended to live at the homestead again. He'd sent his daughter to a property he'd effectively abandoned. "I see," Roy said carefully. "He suggested I might want to return east." Her voice remained steady, but her fingers twisted the napkin in her lap. "Or perhaps find a position in town." "What will you do?" She looked around the cabin they'd worked so hard to restore. "I'm not going back east, and I'm not sure what position would suit me in town." Her gaze met his, direct and unfaltering. "I think I'd like to stay here. Make this work somehow." "Alone," the word escaped before he could stop it. "Is that so impossible?" A challenge entered her voice. "You manage alone." "It's different." "Because you're a man," her eyes flashed. "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Daniels, and I learn quickly." "It's not about strength." Roy struggled to articulate the danger he sensed. "Winter's coming, storms that can kill if you're not prepared. Wolves get hungry. And there are men worse than wolves when they know a woman's alone." "Then I'll need to be prepared, won't I?" She stood and began gathering dishes. "I don't expect you to stay beyond our agreement. But while you're here, I'd appreciate if you'd teach me everything I need to know. No more protecting me from the harsh realities." Roy watched her move about the cabin, efficient and purposeful. Something twisted in his chest, respect mingled with a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. The combination was dangerous, threatening the careful isolation he'd built around himself. 2 weeks left in our arrangement," he said finally. "We'll make them count." That night, Roy lay awake longer than usual, turning over the problem in his mind. Olivia Vance couldn't survive winter alone, not her first winter, not without experience. Yet she seemed determined to try. The thought of riding away, leaving her to face the brutal Wyoming winter unprotected, sat like a stone in his gut. For the first time in years, Roy's carefully constructed philosophy, that survival meant standing alone, felt hollow against the reality of a woman with trout-catching hands and a stubborn chin. The following days took on new urgency. Roy no longer merely fixed what needed immediate attention. He began preparing the homestead for winter as if his own survival depended on it. He showed Olivia how to chop and stack firewood, how to read weather signs, how to shoot the rifle he insisted she keep loaded by the door. For her part, Olivia absorbed every lesson with intense focus. She practiced shooting until her shoulder ached, learned to distinguish edible plants from poisonous ones, and insisted on trying her hand at skinning the rabbits Roy trapped. Her spectacles now remained perched on her nose during these practical lessons, her hair frequently escaping its braid as she worked. "You're a quick study," Roy admitted one afternoon as they salted meat for storage. "Quicker than most men I've known." She smiled at the compliment, a strand of hair falling across her face. I've had an excellent teacher." Something in her tone made him glance up. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment neither looked away. Roy felt a dangerous warmth spreading through his chest, a sensation he'd thought long buried with his youthful hopes. "We should check the north fence tomorrow," he said abruptly, breaking the moment. "Needs reinforcing before snow." If Olivia noticed his sudden shift, she gave no sign. But later that evening, as they sat before the fire, she broke their companionable silence. "Why do you live alone, Roy?" Her question was gentle but direct. He stared into the flames. "Simpler that way. Simpler isn't always better. It is out here," he poked at the fire, watching sparks rise. "People who depend on each other get hurt when one can't deliver. The frontier doesn't forgive weakness. Is that what happened to you? Someone failed you?" Roy's jaw tightened. "I failed them. My brothers during the war, a woman after." The words emerged rusty from disuse. "Promised to protect them." "Couldn't." Olivia was silent for so long he thought she might have dropped the subject. Then she said quietly, "My mother died when I was born. Father always said I was his ugly duckling, not pretty like her, but smart in my own way. He meant it kindly, I think, but," she shrugged, "it's why he sent me east. Thought education might compensate for my plainness." "You're not plain," the words escaped before Roy could stop them. She looked up, startled. "You don't need to say that. I'm not in the habit of saying things I don't mean." Color rose in her cheeks. "Then you need spectacles worse than I do." Roy found himself smiling at her self-deprecation. "You've never really seen yourself, have you?" "I've seen enough mirrors to know the truth." She stood suddenly. "It's getting late. We should rest if we're checking fences tomorrow." As she retreated to her bedroom, Roy remained by the fire, troubled by the exchange. He'd spoken honestly. Somewhere in the weeks they'd worked together, Olivia Vance had transformed in his eyes. Not through any dramatic change in her features, but through the revelation of her character, her determination, her intelligence, her quiet courage. The realization left him profoundly unsettled. Admiration was dangerous. Attachment was dangerous. In 10 days he would return to his solitary existence, and she would either leave the territory or face the winter alone. Neither outcome should matter to him personally, yet increasingly, undeniably, it did. Storms coming. Roy squinted at the horizon 3 days later as they returned from town with supplies. Dark clouds gathered over the western mountains, and the air had taken on the metallic scent that preceded heavy snow. Olivia followed his gaze. How soon? Tonight most likely could last days. He urged his horse to a faster pace. "We need to prepare." They worked with single-minded focus for the remainder of the afternoon, securing loose items, bringing extra firewood into the cabin, moving the horses into the barn with ample feed. By nightfall, the wind had picked up considerably, howling around the eaves of the cabin. "First big storm of the season," Roy said as they finished a hurried supper. "Might want to fill extra water buckets in case the well freezes." Olivia nodded, already moving to the task. They worked in practice tandem now, anticipating each other's movements without discussion. When the first snow began falling, they had done all they could to prepare. "You should stay in the cabin tonight," Olivia said, looking out at the rapidly deteriorating conditions. "Your Linta won't offer much protection in this." Roy hesitated. Propriety dictated he maintain separate quarters, but practicality argued otherwise. "I'll sleep by the fire," he conceded finally. As the night deepened, so did the storm. Wind screamed down the chimney, and snow accumulated rapidly against the windows. Roy added logs to the fire, grateful for their ample wood supply. Olivia emerged from her bedroom wrapped in a quilt, unable to sleep through the tempest. "Is it always like this?" she asked, settling into a chair across from him. "Sometimes worse." He poured her a cup of coffee from the pot kept warm at the edge of the hearth. "This is why I was concerned about you wintering alone." She accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "I understand your concern better now." After a moment she added softly, "Thank you for not saying I told you so. Would be poor manners." The firelight cast warm highlights in her hair, and Roy found himself noticing how it curled slightly at her temples. "Besides, you've proven hardier than most would have wagered." High praise from a man of few words. Her smile held a warmth that belied the storm's fury outside. They fell into conversation as the hours passed, sharing stories they'd avoided during their weeks of practical labor. Roy spoke of his childhood in Missouri, his brothers lost at Shiloh, his wandering after the war. Olivia described Boston's cobbled streets, her aunt's lending library, her secret dream of writing stories of her own someday. What kind of stories? Roy asked, genuinely curious. She looked embarrassed. Adventures mostly, explorations of uncharted places. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup. I always imagined far-off lands, but now I realize the frontier holds adventures I never dreamed of. Like catching trout with your bare hands. Her laugh brightened the room, exactly like that, or surviving blizzards. Or learning to shoot. She glanced toward the window, where snow now completely obscured the glass, though I admit this particular adventure is more frightening than I anticipated. You're safe here, Roy said, the protective instinct rising in him again. Cabin's solid, we've got food, water, firewood. Because of you, she met his gaze directly, I would have been woefully unprepared without your help. You'd have managed. Even as he said it, Roy knew it wasn't entirely true. The storm raging outside could kill even experienced frontiersmen caught unprepared. Perhaps, her expression turned thoughtful, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out alone. Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of mutual dependence that contradicted everything Roy had believed about survival. The woman across from him had grown stronger under his guidance, yes, but he had changed too. The cabin felt more like home than his own homestead had in years. The realization terrified him. Should check on the horses, he said abruptly, rising and reaching for his coat. Roy, the storm. Won't take long. He needed air, space, distance from the dangerous warmth growing in his chest. The journey to the barn, only yards from the cabin, proved treacherous. Wind-driven snow blinded him, and cold cut through his clothing with vicious intent. By the time he reached the barn door, Roy understood he'd made a potentially fatal error in judgment. Inside, the horses nickered nervously, sensing the storm's violence. Roy checked them quickly, finding everything secure, but when he turned to leave, the full implication of his situation became clear. The short distance back to the cabin might as well have been miles in the whiteout conditions. Visibility had dropped to nothing, and the temperature continued to plummet. Roy sat heavily on a hay bale, cursing his own foolishness. Pride and fear had driven him out into a killer storm. Now he faced a choice. Risk the journey back or wait out the night in the barn's lesser shelter. Neither option appealed, but the former carried greater danger. He had just resigned himself to a miserable night when the barn door cracked open, admitting a swirl of snow and a heavily bundled figure. Roy, Olivia's voice carried over the storm's howl. Astonishment kept him momentarily speechless. She tied a rope around her waist, the other end presumably secured to the cabin. "What are you doing?" he demanded when he found his voice. "You could have been lost." "I secured a guide rope." She stomped snow from her boots. "When you didn't return, I thought you might be." She didn't complete the thought. "We should go back together." Roy stared at her, this woman who had ventured into a deadly blizzard to find him. No one in his adult life had taken such a risk on his behalf. The realization cracked something long frozen within him. Together, he agreed, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't express. They followed her rope back to the cabin, fighting wind and cold every step. When they finally stumbled through the door, both were shaking violently from cold and exertion. "That was foolish," Roy said as they shed snow-covered outer garments. "You could have died out there." "So could you," her eyes flashed with unexpected fire. "What was I supposed to do? Sit by the fire and wonder if you were freezing to death?" "Most would have. Then most lack courage." She moved to the fire, extending trembling hands toward its warmth. "Or perhaps they simply don't care enough." The implication hung between them, unavoidable and transformative. Roy crossed to where she stood, turning her gently to face him. "Why did you really come after me, Olivia?" She met his gaze steadily, though color rose in her cheeks. "Because I couldn't bear the thought of losing you." The simple truth of her words dismantled the last of his defenses. In her face, Roy saw reflected everything he denied himself for years: connection, belonging, the possibility of shared strength rather than isolated survival. "I've been a fool," he said softly. "Yes," she agreed with the hint of a smile. "But a well-intentioned one." He reached up, hesitantly brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You see me clearly, don't you, even without your spectacles?" "More clearly than you see yourself, I think." She leaned slightly into his touch. You believe you're stronger alone, but you're wrong. I'm beginning to understand that. Outside, the storm raged unabated. Inside, something equally powerful but infinitely more gentle grew between them. Roy's hand cradled her cheek, and Olivia's eyes closed briefly at his touch. I'm supposed to leave in a week, he said, the words painful to speak. Do you want to leave? Her question was direct, her gaze unwavering. For the first time in years, Roy answered with complete honesty, abandoning the philosophy that had governed his adult life. No, I don't want to leave you. The kiss that followed was gentle at first, then deepened with all the emotion they'd both kept carefully contained. When they finally parted, Roy rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed against the overwhelming sensation of barriers falling away. Your father called you his ugly duckling, he said softly. But he never saw the swan you've become. She laughed softly. Now you're being poetic. Just honest, he looked into her eyes, seeing not the plain Easterner of their first meeting, but the remarkable woman who had emerged. You're beautiful, Olivia, not despite your practical spectacles or capable hands, but because of them, because of your courage and determination, because of who you are. Tears shimmered in her eyes. No one has ever seen me that way before. Then no one really looked. He kissed her again, sealing a silent promise. I see you now, and I'm not looking away again. The storm lasted 3 days, transforming the landscape into a crystalline white expanse. Inside the cabin, an equally profound transformation took place. Roy and Olivia emerged from their isolation with the certainty that neither wished to return to solitary existence. I should speak to your father, Roy said as they stood on the porch, surveying the snow-covered homestead. Olivia's hand found his. He'll be surprised. He sent me west thinking frontier men might have lower standards. Her self-deprecating humor couldn't quite hide the lingering hurt. Then he underestimated his daughter considerably. Roy squeezed her hand. And he underestimated what truly matters out here. Beauty fades, character endures. Quite philosophical for a man who claimed the frontier was no place for sentiment, she teased. I've been known to learn from my mistakes. He turned to face her fully. Olivia, I can't offer much. 20 acres, a few head of cattle, a cabin smaller than this one, but it would be ours together. If you'll have me. Her answer came without hesitation. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Spring arrived with new purpose. The small church in Poplar Creek witnessed the union of Roy Daniels and Olivia Vance beneath a canopy of wildflowers. Judge Vance returned from his circuit to give his daughter away, visibly shocked by the transformation in the young woman he'd once dismissed as his ugly duckling. I hardly recognized you, he admitted at the modest celebration afterward. You've bloomed, Olivia. She exchanged a knowing look with her new husband. I simply found where I belong, father, and someone who sees me clearly. Roy and Olivia combined their homesteads, building a life that balanced his practical frontier knowledge with her organizational skills and love of learning. The small cabin on Roy's property soon expanded to include a library corner, where Olivia began writing down the stories of frontier life she experienced firsthand. When winter returned, they faced it together in a home warmed not just by a well-tended fire, but by the certainty that survival wasn't about standing alone, it was about standing together. On the coldest nights, Roy would often watch his wife as she read by lamplight, her spectacles perched on her nose, her hair loosened from its practical daytime braid. In those moments, he marveled at how he'd ever thought her plain. To his eyes, she had become the most beautiful woman in the territory, not because her features had changed, but because he had learned to truly see. The promise he'd made to care for the judge's ugly duckling had transformed into something neither of them had expected. In helping Olivia find her strength, Roy had found his heart, and in loving him, Olivia had discovered her own beauty, not the fragile kind that fades with seasons, but the enduring kind that grows stronger with each challenge faced together. On their homestead near Poplar Creek, they built a life that defied the harsh realities of the frontier not by denying them, but by facing them side by side, and in doing so, they discovered the most important frontier truth of all. That love, properly tended, could flourish even in the wildest places.